Hey everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Tom Latimer, ESG Director here at Socialsuite. We're excited to bring you a discussion around key trends related to ESG and sustainability for 2024. So just before we do get started, just a couple of housekeeping points. You'll notice there is a chat box to the right-hand side. Feel free to put any questions as we're going along through the webinar. We will leave 10-15 minutes towards the end to do a Q&A as well. So as many of you know, obviously sustainability is a rapidly evolving space, so hopefully we can demystify a few things for you today. And to help me do so, we're joined by an amazing panel who I would like to introduce. So first of all, we're joined by Dr. Tim Siegenbeek van Heukelom, who is the Chief Impact Officer at Socialsuite. We've also got Olivia Pitt, who has a couple of hats from an investment management perspective with Elliston Capital, but also head of advisory at Anna Branch ESG. Also joined by Tim Pertles, the two Tims, Director of ESG Business Advisory Services at Slalom. And finally, Lil Barrick-Macy, who is the Managing Director at Q Social Impact. So without further ado, over to you, Socialsuite, Tim.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom, for that introduction. And it's a great pleasure to have such a knowledgeable panel here about ESG and sustainability. So it's really great that we can jump into that and explore the landscape with a focus on Australia, like what can we expect this year? It's always hard to predict things. I spoke to someone who said that, you never know how things really turn out, but we do see some trends in sustainability. We see certain things drop off. We see certain topics carry over from last year. There's definitely areas where there is more of an acceleration, and we'll pick up on some of those, and then new and emerging areas as well. So before we look at what are the topics that we're going to talk about today, we've got a handful that we really believe are worth to just discuss and pick apart a little bit. I want to go to the panel first and just ask them really briefly, what are some of the things, if we do a quick retro, that stood out from last year? So any particular things that you think that was a surprise, or that's something that's still carrying over? Any comments there? So maybe I'll start with Olivia there. Any thoughts looking back on last year?
Last year felt a lot less frenzied when it came to ESG. People were being far more practical, and as such, their disclosures became a little bit more credible. And we can talk about greenwashing soon, but that was the sort of main center. Everyone sort of calmed down and really took a first basis approach to ESG again, and it felt far more realistic and less decorated.
I love that. And I think that probably plays into one of our topics about mandatory disclosures as well, about the consolidation of a lot of those voluntary frameworks. There's a bit more harmonization, a bit more direction and guidance about what you should be doing, and people are less all over the place in the alphabet soup of ESG. So I think it's a good comment. Lil, I'd like to go to you next. What are your thoughts looking back?
Well, it's interesting to hear Olivia talk about that less decoration and more substance. We certainly saw that as well with our client base. We're also seeing a little bit of that metaphor of the duck, or the swan gliding above water and then paddling madly beneath the surface. And our clients are definitely, working towards improving their disclosures, getting the data to a robust stage where it can be verified by the auditors as is required in the coming financial year cycle. We're also seeing a number of organisations think about how do they bolster up their sustainability team. They need to have additional capability, additional capacity as well to continue to disclose what's required of them in that way that is going to be applying more due diligence, but also to address those disclosures that are now going to be moving from voluntary to mandatory.
Great point. I think the main thing, we really see, as you point out, that sustainability is really kind of coming into its own right. It's becoming this separate function. It's no longer something that's pawned off to IR or communications. It is really something that is being resourced more and more. And I think in the years to come as well, we'll see a big boom there around really kind of making sure there's capacity and capability within teams. Finally then, Tim, your thoughts on where we left off from 2023.
Yeah, no, I think Lil and Olivia covered it really well. I think the only thing to add is companies are starting to look at how do we continue to do this sustainably, pun intended, right? So there's a lot of effort, the whole swan thing, swim really hard, right? How do they create those both technology capabilities and people capabilities, but more in the services forward-looking business cases, right? So yes, mandatory compliance is kind of the mandatory reporting and compliance is the thing that's driving a lot of this, but a lot of companies are now starting to think a little bit ahead of that too and go, how do I start to build a case for creating this engine now to serve things later and being more forward-looking?
Wonderful. And on that note, that's a great bridge to our topics today. So if we jump to the end of the list, we'll end the webinar talking about how do you create sustained sustainability? So to your point, Tim, how do you make sure that this is really something that, you know, can last and it's not a one-off exercise, and build that capacity and capability internally? Other topics we'll touch upon that the panel already flagged. We'll talk about greenwashing, about those mandatory disclosures globally in Australia, but mostly the implications. We'll flag what materiality is doing in this mix there. We hear a lot about materiality. Why is that important? We'll talk about the value and supply chain and about accelerating societal pressure. Like, who are the people that are actually putting pressure on doing ESG and doing sustainability? Not just doing it, but doing it well too. So we'll take it through that. Going to that first topic there, greenwashing. So really kind of, I think most people know that really what it is about false or misleading corporate sustainability efforts. So that could be all kind of things. But the big question then is, like, it's not a new issue, it's carrying over. It's clearly something that's been on the radar. But what we do see globally, there are a lot more stronger legal definitions coming into play. Europe is really kind of driving that forward, really banning generic environmental claims now, making sure that it's really clear what you can't do for that matter. But also the consequences are much larger there. We've seen some massive fines globally, but here in Australia as well, the ACCC is really taking this very serious. So we're going to expect a lot more from the court cases around that, but also the guidance now about how to avoid that. What can we expect going forward? What do you think from the customers that you work with, the organizations that you work with, that we will see around greenwashing? Is it still a major concern, or are people kind of getting their head around what it is and how to avoid it? We'll do the other way around now. Tim, I'll just first jump to you in that case. What are your thoughts on greenwashing going forward?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it still is a thing, right? I think the regulatory focus on greenwashing are going to help folks kind of understand the guardrails. What happened in the US, and I kind of see happening here a little bit, or starting to happen here, is green hushing, right? Because there's so much focus and visibility, companies are going to be a little bit more cautious around goal setting, a little more cautious around target setting. Now, as an environmentalist and someone who wants to see social change like myself, it's a bit disheartening, but helping companies figure out how do you set credible targets, then move to moonshot targets and help them through that while managing greenwashing and expectations and not do green hushing, I think is going to be the balance we're going to be striking for the next little bit.
It's a good point. We hear that more and more, and we've seen that a lot of organizations are, trying to find that sweet spot, the balance there. We don't want to definitely not make claims that we can't substantiate, so no greenwashing, but you don't want to go to the opposite where you're not disclosing anything and green hushing, but being afraid to greenwash. So that whole kind of finding that sweet spot there, just disclosing the key things. And I think looking forward, we'll talk a little bit about materiality. I think that gives companies a real good sweet spot to really report on what's important and don't overcommit. Lil, Olivia, any further thoughts on greenwashing from your perspectives? Maybe I'll jump to you first, Olivia. Any things you expect?
Sure. So as Tim rightly said, green hushing is coming into the foreground. We're seeing something called green wishing. I've seen motive greenwashing. I've seen blue washing. I've seen rainbow washing. It's not just the environmental aspects, right? We're looking at the social side. We're looking at companies being a little bit more LGBTQA+ focused during certain times of the year. Maybe that's associated with Mardi Gras events and stuff like that. It can kind of sit a little bit uncomfortably to some people that are watching these companies from afar, and that is where the greenwashing risk will continue because sometimes the sin of vagueness just comes through with these company disclosures, and they can get themselves in a predicament without really realizing that they've found themselves in it.
Good points. It's not just green, it's washing of all colours, basically. Lil, any thoughts on this topic?
Well, I think Tim and Olivia have summarised it very well. The only other point that I wanted to add is that the two watchdogs here in Australia, ASIC and the ACCC, have progressively moved down towards that enforcement path. So they originally started with a carrot. Now they're coming through a lot stronger with that stick. So ASIC on the investor side and taking the investors' best interests seriously. And they've certainly started court proceedings against one asset management fund that I can think of here in Australia that happened last year. So that might have led to a little bit more green hushing in the investment space. But on the consumer side of things, you've got the ACCC who have released a recent document around the 8 principles to ensure that any claims that are made by way of, sustainability or environmental sorts of claims are backed up with evidence, how to make sure that your claims are trustworthy. And I do encourage any organisation that is consumer facing to jump online, the ACCC website, and download those 8 principles and share that internally with your marketing and your sales teams.
That's a great recommendation. That business guidance, it's short to the point, and it really kind of lays out the steps what you should be doing effectively to avoid that. Before we jump to the next topic, we had in our US webinar on greenwashing, we spoke also about, like Mike Hauer, who's really a sustainability communications expert, said, as an organization, you also don't need to have a perspective on everything. So you don't need to jump into the conversation on everything. Really follow your values and have a view on certain issues that matter to you, but you don't have to jump into every issue and take a strong stand there. So I think that's a really good one as well. We look at not just greenwashing, but other forms of that as well. So next topic then is now something that I think really has been clear. This is definitely a carryover, but really mostly this is accelerating massively. So what we've seen in ESG reporting the landscape is that to a large degree, it's been for a long time voluntary reporting. We saw that organizations were reporting because there was stakeholder pressure, often investor pressure, that they realized that sustainability is important to investment decisions. So give me some information, but it was pretty much not comparable. It was based on a whole range of standards and frameworks. Now they are consolidating at that voluntary level. That's great. But also the next level is now we see that a lot of this mandatory legislation is coming in. So really driving the pack there is Europe. They're really the front runner there. They're doing, as you see, a lot more than I've even listed here. Other individual European countries are having their own additional compliance frameworks they put in place. We see in the US as well, there's been some talk for a long time now by the SEC. One of the states, California, said it's taking too long, we'll do it ourselves. Canada saying one of those voluntary frameworks from the IFRS, ISSB will implement that. We'll look at how we're doing that. The Australian Standards Board is doing the same thing. So they're looking at how can we take that and repackage that to make sure it's really fit for our market here. So that's coming. There's some really good webinars happening specifically on that topic. New Zealand's doing a lot of climate-related disclosures already. So there's a lot happening and coming in this space. The purpose today is not to talk about what each of these legislations are really meant to do. There's a lot of in-depth, like I said, webinars and guidance already on that, and there's a lot more to come. It's more about what are the implications of this for organizations. So they might have already done some voluntary reporting. There's now more mandatory disclosures coming. What are the worries, the pain points, the roadblocks, but also the opportunities for organizations with this wave of mandatory disclosures? Maybe Lil, I'll jump to you first. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's good to see this slide here. I think that it's super important for the participants on the call to recognise that it's not just what we're dealing with here in Australia or in New Zealand or in Asia. There's a whole wave of new disclosures that are being mandated around the world. Tim, you raised a really good set of disclosures, which, again, we don't have time to go into detail about. But the implications of these, the new raft of disclosures is that they're going to start hitting companies in Australia locally. And you might think, okay, we don't have operations in Europe or we don't have operations in the US. We don't need to worry too much about it. But we've got a situation there in Europe where those reporting standards are actually going to capture more than the 50,000 companies that are being targeted at the moment by those standards. They're going to start capturing those organisations that are headquartered in other parts of the world who might have subsidiaries in Europe, also companies that have supply chains that have substantial and significant subsidiaries or companies and work there in Europe. So we're looking at things like double materiality as a result of that. That's what the European standards are mandating, and a very robust new way of looking at materiality, which companies in Australia haven't had to do up to now.
Some good points. There are massive ramifications throughout this wave of legislation. So it's really important not to look just at what's happening here in Australia, but the ripple effects from Europe. You might be directly captured by that in one way or another, indirectly, or just a ripple effect that you're in someone's supply chain. You have a customer who requires that. Tim, any further thoughts on what the implications are of all this legislation that's facing us?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's an awesome opportunity and it's a great shift. I think the thing we have to help the folks we're working with is remind them of the why. It's very easy to get lost in compliance and checking boxes and go, oh, this is really hard and there's so much stuff and what's going on. Remind them, right, as Lil said, around double materiality, right? Does material impact your business, right? And that's your ability to create value. And it's also your ability to serve your customers and engage in your supply chain. So while it might feel compliance-led and it feels like a bit of a stick and we have to, there's a really good business reason behind it. And as Lil mentioned before, investors are keen to see it and see companies do it because it's the effective way to run a business.
It's a great point. So a lot of this should not be seen just as ticking box exercise, but as an opportunity to do better business, do responsible business. I think that's a really good kind of frame of mind there. Olivia, any thoughts from you on this?
Look, what we're seeing on the screen here is actually a consolidated version. This is an improved way of disclosures and reporting and expectations for companies in different countries than it has been for the last, say, 15 plus years around sustainability reporting and mandatory disclosures. We used to have many hundreds of reporting frameworks that companies could report against or align to. And I'm not surprised that some companies' uptake was so slow on things like sustainability reporting, because it really was an overcomplicated space. And what we're going into, hopefully in 2024, it'll get locked down in Australia. Or sorry, I should say, lockdown is a triggering term nowadays, but we should be confirming the legislation in Australia will actually make it far easier for companies compared to what it has been in the last decade or so.
Two really good points that I'd like to pick up on in relation to our next topic is that we had a very kind of fragmented and complex voluntary reporting landscape. Now that is really consolidated. And what we see now is, if you look at large, now the two really key players there, that's on the one hand, the Global Reporting Initiative, which are more looking at how are you as an organization impacting the world and reporting on that to stakeholders. And on the other hand, we see a lot of those frameworks that have consolidated into IFRS's ISSB, and they're really focused on getting investors the material information that they need from a sustainability point of view to inform their decision-making on a particular company. So an impact materiality point of view from GRI or a financial materiality point from ISSB. And that goes to the point that we heard two panelists raise now about double materiality. And that is really what the Europeans are now mandating, even, is saying that both of these perspective dimensions on materiality are equally important to really understand what your overall impact as a business is on the world, but also what the world's impact is on you. So what that means is that you really need to start thinking not just about your stakeholder group that are your investors, but also about wider stakeholders and even investors that are really interested in seeing how your company is impacting the world. And often out of those impacts, there are direct and indirect risks and opportunities. So that approach now that the EU is mandating is actually flowing out. So even if you're not touched directly by the CSRD in Europe, it might still mean that double materiality, which is becoming really quickly like the gold standard for doing materiality, it's a really important starting point in your reporting journey. So effectively working out what are the topics I should be reporting on? That is effectively materiality. Now, how do you get started with that? And is there a right or a wrong approach in this? So if a company does not do double materiality this year, but maybe next year, or only focuses on GRI's approach, because that's what they've been doing for a long time, or still thinking about financial materiality, what's happening in this space, and what are your views on that? Olivia, can I start with you?
Absolutely can, Tim. So how about I answer this from an investor perspective? So I represent an investment house here as well. So for me, with my investor hat on, we have internal and sometimes external expectations and pressures from our investors or our stakeholders. And so we want to be making the right decisions in where we put our capital. If a company isn't really telling us that they care about the things that we care about, or the pools of money that we receive cares about, it's going to be very hard for us to justify an investment, regardless of what some of the financial metrics say. So look, materiality is certainly in a war zone at the moment, you're quite right. But I think we just start at first principles and just start with looking at the company and what they immediately do and how they can impact their immediate stakeholders without thinking too large or too broad. And then that sets such an intent for, people like me or companies like mine in the investment space, so we can actually see that there's some progress and some focus. Because otherwise, we're there up the creek without a paddle and not really sure what the company cares about.
Great insight there. Lil, what are your thoughts in your practice there? Where do you see kind of, companies move towards, and what are your thoughts on this?
Sure. A couple of things. Number one, Olivia is spot on with the investor view. We've been talking to investors who have pretty much said the same. They want to see that there is, and again, I'll use that word, the rigor applied to assessing what those material issues are for a particular organisation or asset that they're investing in. But beyond that, the other stakeholders, Tim, that you mentioned, they're also key to this entire materiality puzzle. And I think from an organisation's perspective, they need to be across what it means when we talk about financial materiality versus that impact materiality. So just bringing it right down to a level where if we've got some beginners in sustainability on the call, financial materiality relates to issues that are either environmental or social or governance oriented that can have an effect on your revenue, your organisation's cost of doing business, the assets of your organisation, the liabilities of your organisation, or even securing capital to run the business. Okay, that's a financial materiality issue. Anything that's impact related is something that can be either a negative impact or a positive impact. So back to what Tim was talking about, that opportunity piece and value creation is very much going to become a part of that materiality assessment when we talk about double materiality, in air quotes. So how it's affecting organisations today in companies that certainly we're working with, we've got clients who are now looking at double materiality assessments because they have significant operations in Europe. We've got organisations looking at it because they know that their investors are asking for it. We've got organisations looking at it because they know that they're going to be reporting in 2 to 3 years' time, and they just need to know from this moment in time what they're up for so they can start building up their capacity and capability. But the piece I wanted to add there, Tim, was around the impact materiality and how important it's going to be for organisations to apply more, again, rigour. And what I mean by that is to address impact in the way that other risks are addressed in an organisation. So applying risk assessment methodology to sustainability material issues is going to be the way forward from 2024 on.
Excellent, really good insight there, Lil. Thanks for sharing that. And then Tim, where do you see things heading?
Last little nugget on top that was super comprehensive. I just think about it as closing the loop, right? Financial materiality is, how is everything else going to impact my business? But then my business impact on the planet, if I'm saying, climate change is a risk for my business and carbon is a major driver for that, if I'm actively contributing to driving down carbon, I'm just relying on others to solve that for me, right? So how am I as a business helping be responsible for solving some of the challenges that are impacting my business and really closing that loop and understanding my responsibilities and opportunities within that loop.
Excellent. Yeah, and I think that is indeed where everyone is going to. How's the world impacting my business? That's what, you know, financial materiality looks at. But then how is your business impacting the world? So closing that loop there and getting that insight. And I think that is what we see happening now, that everyone's realizing like you need to look at both perspectives and really kind of do that in a rigorous way. And that's why CSRD and the Europeans are really kind of pushing for that. So I think the trend there is that double materiality is becoming the gold standard for doing materiality going forward. Another really key area that there's a lot of focus on is really the value chain, the supply chain, and engaging with suppliers, having clear transparency on that. And one of the key things that came up a lot looking at what is ahead this year is radical transparency in the supply chain. So what does that mean? It could mean a lot of things, but it's really looking at some of the reporting you might be doing, you know, as part of what's requested to you within your supply chain, but also product footprint and life cycles. There's a whole component about in your supply chain, what's happening about labor and human rights, particularly important. Then there's how do you actually then map your supply chain and how do you engage with them, especially if you're a larger company, at what levels, tier 1, 2, 3 suppliers, all the way down, and how do you manage policies about responsible procurement and sourcing? How do you actually implement them? And how are you transparent on all this? So this is really a key area where a lot of companies will struggle with, most likely, like really kind of that mapping exercise, the transparency, it's a big piece of work. And Tim, going to you, where do you think that, you know, what are the main issues around this or opportunities for that matter for companies?
Yeah, I think, you know, as we were talking about the ripple effects coming out of CSRD and yes, you know, those companies in Europe and then their supply chains, the similar thing's going to happen in Australia with mandatory disclosure here. You know, the first wave of folks, right, they're going to be ready. And while they're getting ready for their, you know, their scope 3 a little bit later, they're going to be pushing down their supply chains, right, and starting to ask questions and ask for data that perhaps their supply chain is ready for. But they need to get a handle on that. The opportunity there, though, is to engage in a supply chain, because engaging the entire value chain is where there's real opportunity for decarbonisation. It's difficult as an individual actor within that value chain to be able to move the needle. If you can go through those value chains and look at industries and start to create change at that scale, you can really start to drive pretty significant change and help educate others that are earlier in the supply chain or maybe not as advanced, and take the learnings from the companies that are helping drive this through the supply chain. And I don't know, is it a bad pun to say a rising tide lifts all boats when we talk about climate change? But I don't know, right? For the supply chain, I think it's important. How do we help each other?
Exactly. And I think that is the key there, that even if you're not in the first group that needs to do this, you're probably part of someone's supply chain who needs to do this. So you're somewhere in a value chain. So even if you're not ready yet, from a mandatory point of view, you'll probably get requests for information regardless. So I think it really means that you need to be ready and understand not just your own supply chain, but where do you fit into someone else's value and supply chain. Olivia, any thoughts from you on this topic?
Yes, so supply chains are highly complex. That's the globalized world that we live in today. And, you know, before you know it, we go offshore within supply chains, and that can become pretty murky and a bit uncertain around things. So what I really want to make clear to the companies today is that, and everyone listening, is that I am yet to see a company map out their whole supply chain. It is completely iterative, and it is absolutely an upskilling and engagement process. It will continue to be a process, and I would like to see a place where the whole world is mapped, but that just feels very unrealistic and utopian. So for now, like as Tim rightly said, it's a bit of a journey. It's engagement with what you can sort of directly sort of touch and feel in the first instance, perhaps tier 1 suppliers. And then who knows, they could be quite an engaged party in a smaller company that they're quite happy to learn about this plan that you have around your supplier engagement, and then push it down to their suppliers. And you could actually achieve some great outcomes just from education and just being a friendly face as part of their supply chain.
Very good point. And I see a question just come in very kind of, on topic here about the tension between that radical transparency and commercial and confidence, and how do you manage that, which is a really interesting topic. And we see at large in reporting, a lot of the standard setters say that you do all this reporting and you only, again, materiality, focus on the topics that really matter, that reach that materiality threshold, but also it needs to not be at undue cost and effort there. Like it needs to be all, within reason of what you can do. And that's why there's a lot of flexibility and no one expects you to be perfect overnight. So I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, that no one expects you to overnight do everything, spend millions of dollars on this. It is about genuine efforts and demonstrating that you're making that effort there. And in terms of that supply chain there's a lot of evidence you can provide about not having that, fully, like you said, hardly anyone has done that or will be able to do that quite easily, that fully mapped supply chain. But where are you and what are your efforts, and is there some way that you can demonstrate, if you have a human rights policy, that you actually are implementing that in your supply chain? What are the ways there? So you don't have to per se show every little detail there, but it is about genuinely showing the process and the steps you're taking to go through that. Lil, finally going to you. Any thoughts on supply chains and transparency from you?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think my fellow panelists have covered it quite well. The only point that I think I could add to this particular conversation is around collaboration. And I think there was some comments made in the chat box around how do we deal with commercial and confidence information. But the key here is collaboration, and certainly through the number of stakeholder interviews that we've run as a part of a materiality assessment, we've talked to suppliers, we've talked to customers, we've talked to tier 2 suppliers who have said, look, we're happy to collaborate and share what we know around mapping our emissions with your client, who happens to be their customer. So it goes upstream and downstream, and I think that collaboration is key. You can talk about emissions without breaching any sort of commercial and confidence information. And that value chain mapping piece is something that's also going to be required from the European Sustainability Reporting Standards perspective. So they are very keen to see how impacts are being addressed across the entire value chain, not just within that company's direct operation. So this value chain piece is going to be more and more important as we see the year unfold.
Excellent, thanks for sharing that. And I think that's a really good takeaway there, that a lot of the mandatory reporting, in particular the European one, are saying, we want to understand from your materiality point of view, not just your business, your operation, your product and service, but that full value chain. You need to do that assessment across everything. So that means you need to first understand what it looks like to be able to do that. So it's really, really interesting to see that the value chain will really play, I think, really like a really accelerating piece in 2024. Then around all the ESG reporting, whether it's voluntary, mandatory, but mostly we see there's been also that accelerating societal pressure there. So we've seen there's all these different groups there, from investors to consumers. There's been a lot of citizen activism, and you get more and more, I think, industry peer pressure and performance, like comparison, benchmarking, like how are you doing? There's that, the legislation is coming, but there's also that regulatory action we saw at greenwashing. So there's all these pressures on companies. Now, if we look at this year, what is likely going to be the largest pressure, or what's the pressure that most people might be, not see coming there? Olivia, can I start with you?
Sure can. Look, I'm endlessly impressed with Gen Z, or the very youngest generations that are out there at the moment. They are so vocal, and I am never seen a movement like the school strike for climate ever happened in our sort of history in that way. So when these youths, I guess, start joining the workforce and start having extreme purchasing power, the demands that come from this group will be pointed. They look for certain accreditations. They want to make sure it's, animal testing free. If something says organic, show me it's organic. It is semi-related to the greenwashing aspect. Their expectations will be high, and rightly so, because we've sort of got away with it. A few companies have got away with it for a little while. They're also quite a litigious group. We have seen increasing issues with groups taking companies to court around what they've said or what they've promised to do and they haven't done it. So watch this space on the litigious aspects of the societal pressures. It hits media headlines and gets a lot of momentum.
Very good point. And last year we saw on the ASX, they did a retail investor landscape research here in Australia, and they found that the youngest group of investors that are really kind of like a generational shift, they really care to that level you described, Olivia, about ESG, about sustainability, about it being more than a tick box exercise, but like show me the evidence. And that group is, you know, moving up in purchasing power, in investments, but also in the workforce there. So from all angles, companies should be really kind of see that coming in you know, moving forward. Lil, what are your thoughts on this?
I'm equally impressed with Gen Z. We love working with individuals who are within this age group because they just see things so differently. The point I wanted to make was around citizen activism and how that plays out in the world of sustainability. We might think that the two worlds are quite different, but they are, you know, very closely interlinked. I'll give you another resource here. The World Economic Forum has just released its global risk report for 2024, and misinformation and also disinformation and adverse outcomes of AI products are listed as very high risks, particularly misinformation and disinformation. And I flag this because we all have access to a mobile phone. I think with that citizen activism comes a level of responsibility. However, with AI-generated bots that can easily disseminate information which is not truthful and which is harmful on a number of different issues right around the world, it fast becomes a political issue, fast becomes an issue that companies need to address, and it can fast become an issue that you know, ordinary citizens need to also have a think about. We all have access to a mobile phone. We all have a healthy yet cynical approach to mainstream media, but I think with that comes a level of responsibility to understand what that lay of the land is and to just wade through with a critiquing eye as to what is and is not, you know, truthful, back to Olivia's point around those claims. But the thing that also leads me to have a little bit of a more watchful eye in this space is that we've got now organised groups. So it's not just the consumers, but we're seeing the organised investor groups now who tackle various issues in sustainability that companies are claiming that they have a viewpoint on or they have a position on. But these organised activist groups are often led by investors who have a vested interest in making that change, either through shareholder resolutions or through, you know, making sure that human rights are duly and adequately addressed. So, for example, there is a group here in Australia, I think it's activists, Investors Against Trafficking, and they have released a roadmap around modern slavery and the sorts of things that organisations today need to address. So if you want to know more about that, jump online to Investors Against Trafficking. They've got an Asia Pacific website and they can give you all the rundown on what you need to apply when it comes to modern slavery, just as a point there for people to take away.
Excellent, thanks. I'd like some 3 really good resources there and thoughts there. That World Economic Forum Global Risk Report is really worth looking at, like very good global overview. Yes, there are a lot of investor groups now, investors that it's mostly at the institutional level coming together on a particular topic, like the investor group on climate change in Australia is a really good other example. And they are extremely detailed. These guys, they're experts, they're in depth, they know exactly what's happening. And that means that they'll ask the right questions. They're not looking for, you know, generic things. They're really kind of now, it's interesting to see that level of expertise at the investor level now. And that really is playing out. And finally, something that, you know, is really good that you put on the map as well, Leo, is that the rise and risk of AI. And what does that mean for organizations there? I think there's a really key component there for that oversight. We saw like big company in the US, the CEO getting fired over their business using AI to generate content and not disclosing that. So there's some real risks from a operational, but also really from a governance perspective. Like, does your board really understand what AI can do? How are you, you know, working towards, you know, societal risks around AI, but also internally in the business? So some really key topics that we'll see. Tim, your thoughts on the societal pressures in 2024?
No worries, apologies. I was just sneezing off camera there, so apologies for flashing in and out. Yes, I kind of see all of these things coalescing and aligning, right? Maybe 20 years ago, each of these groups had disparate views about what it was and where it should go and what it should be. All these things are starting to kind of come together and align and drive. And companies don't have somewhere to point. They used to say, well, yeah, but my consumer doesn't care, or my investors don't understand, or my company can't execute, or my colleagues over here aren't doing this either. All those are going away, right? And the whole idea of disclosure is about accountability, and the idea of accountability is progress. And everyone listed on that screen now is starting to align around what progress they want to see companies driving towards together.
Excellent point. Everyone is kind of, singing from the same sheet right now, which is really important to realize. We're getting to our final topic, so I would recommend everyone, if you still have questions you want to raise, there's already a few popping up in the chat, but if there's any further questions that you have, pop them in now. After this, we'll get to the Q&A, spend a few minutes. We might not be able to answer all questions, but we'll go through a few of them. And as we flagged at the start, like Tim, you brought this up, really good point there, creating sustainability. And I think it's really important to look at like, what can we do around making sure that really sustainability becomes embedded, not as a disclosure function, but as a function of value creation and as a function of, really kind of transforming a business into, being better and doing responsible business at its core. And one of the key things that we see at the moment now, I saw a presentation, a little kind of, slides image here that we put up there. One of the biggest concerns is that, can the whole disclosure, become a distraction, or a red herring for that matter, but mostly a distraction to what we're actually trying to achieve here. So we see now there's all these mandatory and voluntary frameworks with rules and data points, and it's becoming quite a complex function there to do that all properly. So is there a danger here now that companies get stuck in this disclosure purgatory where they're just trying to get through all the frameworks and tick the boxes and submit everything in time, and forgetting that actually why we're doing this is about business integration and value creation? So really important, like a bigger picture question here, I think. Tim, you brought this up at the start, so I'd like to start with you on this, please.
Yeah, absolutely. When you had the big slide of all the disclosures, one of my comments was making sure you're reminded of the why, right? And that's where you went to, Tim, is, why we're doing this, and really is about understanding those externalities, right? And being able to leverage those in a positive way to drive creation. It sounds very mercenarial and very capitalist, right? But it's a business, right? And they truly are impacts on your business, and if you're not considering them and addressing them, then you are missing out on the opportunity, and your business will not be as successful as another one that does, right? Crafting that why as you go through compliance is going to help build the business case internally for you to be able to do disclosure well, and to be able to create those ongoing programs for you to address that. If you can link to your external business value as you're doing this internally, you'll be able to start to stand up the more important mechanisms, right? Disclosure is just a function of transparency. It's the ability of setting up those capabilities within your organization to drive sustainability, to show progress. And guess what? As soon as you do your first report, the next thing that's asked is, show me how you're progressing. And if you've neglected to stand up the capabilities to drive progress, right, your next disclosure report is going to be a please explain.
Excellent point. And I think that whole why, it's really an interesting one, where a lot of the disclosure frameworks and standards are asking for a lot of quantitative, some qualitative statements as well. But what I found really interesting is the World Economic Forum added a metric at the very start and said, well, tell me your why. What is your purpose? So not the mission to, enhance shareholder revenue, every quarter, but really, what is the impact you're having, the positive impact you're having in the world? Like, what is your real purpose of your business? And we found a lot of the customers we work with kind of have to take that step back and really think about that. They all have their mission statements and sometimes a vision about, you're getting a certain resource out of the ground or providing a certain product, but why are you doing that? So it's a really kind of important question to ask yourself. And if you can put that whole reporting into that framework, then suddenly you see that you're doing it for a bigger good. Olivia, what are your thoughts?
No, I wanted to jump in. So knowing your why, absolutely. So that's at a company level, but I actually suggest this to a few corporations is survey your employees. know what they care about when it comes to things like ESG, environmental, social issues. You'd be surprised what the groundswell can do when you realize that your colleagues and peers around you truly care about this. Hopefully they might not, but in most cases they truly do. And then before you know it, you could set up a sort of ESG sort of committee within an organization, and that's self-perpetuating, and that grows the initiatives that Tim was telling us about, that just in case you haven't resourced it well, there is a bit of a groundswell movement, and that can help push the progress along every year while also staying aligned to the company visions and employee retention levels.
Excellent points. And finally, then to end, Lil, what are your thoughts on creating sustainability?
Yeah, it's been interesting the last few years. Certainly, we've been doing materiality assessments for a good, more than half a decade now, since about 2017. And what we've seen change over that time is previously organisations would start with their whole of business and whole of enterprise strategy and then say, oh, sustainability is one of our imperatives. We better go and do a materiality assessment. And that's now flipped well and truly to let's now do a materiality assessment so that we can absorb those risks and opportunities into our business strategy and use that materiality assessment not as that compliance tool, but as that strategic tool, which gives us more perspectives and a lens on what the organisation needs to consider, as well as, understanding where to play and how to win.
Great point to finish on. It's like, do that materiality assessment as early as possible, because there's an infinite number of sustainability topics, but figure out first what really matters to your organization. What should you really focus on in terms of reporting, in terms of strategy setting, resourcing. Once you know that, you're a lot more focused, and it can inform a lot of things that you're doing from there on. So I think that's really one of the key things that is very important to keep in mind going forward, that it's not just to inform your reporting, it's to inform a lot more there. There's a lot more integrated approach that we see going forward. So what I'll do then is I'll invite Tom back to the stage. He's been looking at the chat to see the questions coming in. I'll ask him to do a quick Q&A. I realized that we're kind of at time already, but there might be one or two questions that he's picked out that our panel can answer.
Thanks, Tim, and also thanks to Sal and Tim, Olivia and Lil for the panel, some really useful insights. As Tim said, we've gone a little bit over time, so I'll try and get through a couple as quick as possible, but if we don't manage to get through them all, then we'll respond in due course. So, and Jessica, in relation to that materiality component, are there examples and methods for establishing reporting thresholds for impact materiality, or would they be translated into financial materiality metrics?
It's a really good question there. I don't know, Lil, maybe you have some thoughts on that, but I'll give a really quick overview. My thoughts on that is we do see people definitely translate that more in financial metrics, but at the same time, CSRD is pretty particular in a way about how you can do that. So there's a whole range of, if you really dig into their materiality guidance that they put out there, and they don't tell you exactly every little thing, like how to do it and how to set your own threshold, but they give you a really good framework to think about that. So without really going in detail, and we're likely to do a webinar on double materiality, in which we'll go into more detail about that. There's some really good guidance in there from the impact materiality perspective. Lil, any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, Tim, is that with regards to financial materiality, the best place to start would be with the International Sustainability Standards Board industry level disclosures. So Google SASB industry disclosure standards, and you'll soon find what the bulk of issues are that have been evidenced to affect an organisation's financial prospects, depending on what industry your organisation is in. That's a really good starting point. Then you need to have a look at how that material issue might present itself in your organisation. So talk to the finance team, talk to the risk team, talk to the strategy team, and get a really good read on whether or not those issues are actually going to be financially material for your group. On the impact side, as Tim said, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, which has set out the European sustainability standards, is fairly prescriptive with how you could do that double materiality assessment, yet they say, but we're not endorsing any particular way to do it, but they're very prescriptive with how you could do it. So I'd encourage you also to have a look at that to get a better understanding of what is involved, but it's definitely going to involve that risk assessment methodology piece. That's going to be the way to go forward on defining what is an impact, the severity of the impact, if it's a negative one, what's the scale, the scope, if it's a positive impact, what's the likelihood, what's the scale of this opportunity. So yeah, there's a lot of information out there.
Thanks, Lil. Thanks, Tim. So I think we'll call it time there. And there's a few additional questions, but I said we'll get back to you in due course. Just to Sunita's point, requesting the slides, we will send out the recording following this webinar. We'll also try and include the slides as well. But if anyone's got any other further questions, general around ESG, anything from the webinar today, feel free to also reach out the details below. But yeah, thanks again to our panel, the two Tims, Olivia and Lil. Really appreciate you coming on board. And yeah, thanks everyone else for attending as well. See you later.
Thank you all.
Thank you.